All right. How's the audio, everyone? Are we good? Excellent. Okay, so just like Paul said, we are going to be talking about how to take your ZBrush sculpts all the way to monumental scale bronze. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, just a brief introduction as to who we are. My name is Chris. I'm the sales director for American Fine Arts Foundry. This is Angel. He's our Foundry manager for American.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah. Angel has been the Foundry manager for AFA for
33 years.
Okay.
Well, for AFA Foundry for 23 years.
But in the foundry industry.
In the foundry industry for 33 years.
33. So, my favorite way to kind of position Angel is he has forgotten more about bronze casting than most of us will ever know. So if you guys have questions about that particular portion of the process, we encourage you to ask those. I imagine, given where we are and given that there's an entire generation of sculptors who have only ever sculpted in ZBrush. So we're finding that people who have only ever sculpted digitally, they have no concept, no understanding of the foundry process, the lost wax casting process. And so that's part of what we're going to talk about today. But we're going to do that through the lens of, did I not have that slide? No, we'll get there in a second. We're going to do that through the lens of two projects that Paul kind of teed up earlier, Batman and Wonder Woman. This is kind of a rough outline of how we want to go about that. So we'll talk about typical ZBrush workflows, but we're not going to spend a lot of time there because you guys are the ZBrush experts. We're not. So we're really just using that to juxtapose that part of the process with the bronze casting process. We will go into detail about bronze casting. It's called the lost wax casting process. We'll talk about considerations before you even attempt a project of this scale, things that you're going to want to have in the back of your mind before you even open ZBrush. And then ultimately, we'll talk about the process of actually blending those two processes together. So what does that look like? How do we go from a sculpt in ZBrush, an STL file, all the way to monumental bronze? And like I said, we're going to do that through the lens of these two projects right here. So both 7.5-foot tall bronze sculptures, monumental scale, Batman and Wonder Woman, they were commissioned by the city of Burbank as part of the Visit Burbank initiative. And I think the idea is to kind of create focal points in the city to kind of, especially for tourists, to kind of drive traffic there. They're, selfie opportunities, picture opportunities. But they're in really kind of high foot traffic, popular areas of Burbank. So Batman, for example, is in front of the AMC 16 theater. There's a bunch of kind of local dining and shopping there. And then Wonder Woman is actually installed right outside of the Warner Brothers Visitor Center. So it should also be said these projects were done in collaboration with not just the city of Burbank, but also DC and Warner Brothers. And you'll see they had some pretty substantial input on kind of the direction of this project. So where to begin? The reality is that it starts the way that all of your projects do. It starts with a sculpt in ZBrush. And so you'll see this sculpt right here. This was done by a wonderfully talented artist by the name of Alejandro Pereira. I have his Instagram there for anybody who wants to see his other work. But this is the final version, right? So this is what we use to ultimately end up printing and casting in bronze. And I say final version because there was an original version. And so the original version is what you see here on the left. And you'll notice in terms of composition, it's very similar, but it looks as if it's been kind of cut and keyed as if it's going to be a collectible. Unfortunately, that version of the sculpt wasn't suitable for the casting process. And so we'll get into the specifics as to the how and why of that. But just know there was an original version, and then subsequently, Alejandro was brought back in by DC and Warner Brothers to re-sculpt Batman from the ground up, so that we did have a sculpt that was more suitable for the casting process. And so just some background on that particular image, that sculpt. It was based on a Jim Lee sketch from Hush, which was a story arc, kind of early to mid-2000s, one of the more iconic, popular story arcs for Batman. And so that is one of the panels right there. That was the sketch that Jim Lee did. And Alejandro was brought in originally to do an interpretation of that. And he got notes from, DC, from Warner Brothers, actually from Jim Lee himself, to make sure he kind of maintained the artistic integrity of the two-dimensional version of it. And it was subsequently cast as a collectible figure. So it was a 7-inch resin statue that was part of the black and white series. which for the uninitiated, the black and white series was, and actually is again, under McFarlane Toys, a series of collectibles, all Batman. There was 100+ permutations of Batman, and this particular image, so the Jim Lee variant from Hush, was actually the 3rd most popular image in that line. Again, super iconic image of Batman, and so that's why it was chosen by the city of Burbank, DC, Warner Brothers, to kind of be the image of Batman in Burbank. So, we also did Wonder Woman. Another incredibly talented artist by the name of Jack Matthews did Wonder Woman. We, unfortunately, didn't have access to the files like we did with Alejandro, so it should be said that Alejandro, by the way, great to work with. Super great guy. We had great conversations via email. He sent me over a bunch of files and gave me some cool anecdotes about his part in the process. And so you're going to see the presentation's a little Batman heavy, but it's because I've got a lot of cool stuff from Alejandro for Batman. So for Jack, unfortunately, we don't have the STL files, but this is what the original sculpt looked like. So I wanted you to see the original because similar story. The original sculpt, unfortunately, was not suitable for the bronze casting process. And so Jack was brought back in to resculpt Wonder Woman from the ground up. And you'll notice in terms of composition, whereas Alejandro's sculpt was pretty similar to the original, this one is substantially different, right? You'll notice the removal of the spear. Hair is a little bit different. The cape has been removed. So again, we'll talk about why in a little bit. But those were some of the necessary changes, some of the considerations that needed to be made before we could ultimately cast something at monumental scale. And just like Alejandro's work, it was based on a pre-existing image. So this was a variant cover of Rebirth Wonder Woman number 18 by Jenny Frisson. And again, same story where Jack's original sculpt was for the purpose of a collectible. And so this one's a little bit different. The Batman image that you saw earlier, that was a 1A scale, 7-inch resin figure. This one's actually a 15-inch poly resin figure, so it's a little bit larger. So this is where I hope to not get crucified in the comments, because remember, we are experts at everything that comes after ZBrush and not experts within ZBrush. So probably a little bit different than some of the presenters you saw previously. But this might have been what the ZBrush workflow would have looked like. So maybe if we go back in time and we think about, Alejandro and Jack, and they've just sculpted their original model, they'd probably cut up and key the model, maybe ensure that it's watertight, set the thickness, maybe you use Magics to hollow it out, and then they'd send it off to the printer, right? So their portion of it's done. Is that roughly?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. The sculpting part's missing, though, but...
Well, of course. That goes without saying, but sure.
Chris, that's the long part.
It's kind of an important step.
It's
Yeah.
an important
That should have been
step.
step one.
Yes. No, you're pretty much, that's pretty much, you're going to cut up, key it, figure out what you're going to do, for
Right.
sure. And then, got to have watertight because you're going to 3D print it.
Yep.
Set your thicknesses. Yeah.
Okay.
Especially save on material. Yeah.
So then it gets sent off to the printer, and in this case, it's DC Direct. And so they're done, right? Like you can do whatever you want with it, print it out, mold it, and make additions and all that stuff. And so you would think that if you were going to do the same thing for bronze casting, you would just, at monumental scale, you just make it bigger. You just scale it up and send it out, and it'd probably be the same thing. But that's actually not how it works. So before I get into all of the considerations and why those original sculpts needed to be modified, I do want to talk in detail about the bronze casting workflow, because like I said, there's an entire generation of people, and maybe not necessarily the people in the audience today, but maybe kids that are going to watch this later on, that have only ever sculpted in ZBrush and know nothing about traditional sculpting or the lost wax casting method. And so it's important to understand that so that you can understand why we made some of the decisions we made as far as changing the composition, and again, all of those considerations that we referenced earlier. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about the lost wax casting methods so you guys have an understanding of how traditionally, if we were to have been brought something in clay, right, this is what the process would look like. So I'm going to have Angel take over this portion of the presentation because, again, he is our Foundry guru. So he's going to take you through step by step. There's a roughly 11-step process to taking something, an original sculpture in clay, and then reproducing that subsequently in bronze. So first step, mold making.
Mold making. Well, basically, we need to start with the original that is created. Basically, traditionally will be in clay. In this particular case, you can see our mold maker encapsulating the figure, which is the artwork, with some kind of clay. He's in the process of making divisions, shims, and preparing the original to be molded. Basically, he is adding some kind of like a water-based clay to create the negative space that is going to be used to pour the silicone rubber into that mold. Once all of that is made, then he will remove the clay, the shims, he will pour the silicone, and then that silicone becomes the negative, which is going to be the mother mold that we're going to be using to create the wax that is going to get lost in the process. So we can move to that.
Okay. So then what?
And here we will have the wax figure. In this particular case, we have the head of Batman right here. So that wax coming out of the mold traditionally is going to have some seam lines, air bubbles, and things that are normal in the process. We do have our expertise, wax cleaners, that will come back to that particular piece and remove all the air bubbles, the seam lines. We will try to reproduce the texture that is lost in the process of removing the seam lines and the bubbles. And for that, we normally will create our own tools, or sometimes there are tools that already exist, and we'll come back and just use the tools and recreate the texture that get lost in that process.
So there's two additional things I wanted to note real quick, too. So the artisans that we have in the back chasing wax, and I can only speak for our foundry, but I think this is the case in many foundries. They've been back there for 20-plus years, right? They're artists in their own right. And so you have to remember that, you know, when you're pulling a traditional wax, there can be imperfections, inconsistencies that they then have to match. So if there's this really intricate texture or this really fine detail, they themselves have to go back and recreate that detail. So it's pretty incredible what they do. And the other thing I wanted to note is that what you're looking at here, rather, it actually isn't wax. We're kind of fibbing a little bit. This image is actually, and I'm skipping ahead, but it's one of the prints that we got from our printer. It looks very similar to wax, and because we're talking about Batman or Wonder Woman, we decided to use this image. But technically, this isn't wax. So this is the next step of the process.
I want to go back to the,
sure.
so that we can explain a little bit about the gating.
Yep.
So like if you see at the bottom of the red part of Batman face, you can see some kind of channels, some gates, we call them. Those are the sprues that we add to the piece in order for the bronze to be injected into the mold, secondary mold that we're going to be showing you on the next slide. Those channels that we call gates are going to become a negative. So once we make and finish the shell, we're going to melt the wax. And what you see right now is going to become a negative that is going to receive the molten bronze inside.
Okay. Now shell.
So there you go. So that is the shell process. So basically what we are doing is we are using slurries, silicas, and shell material that is going to create a secondary mold that is going to get lost in the process as well. This is going to get destroyed in the process of making the bronze. So little by little, we're dipping the waxes into our ceramic tanks. We apply silicas, and we make the secondary mold that later in the process is going to get vitralized by applying heat. That silica feels like a glass, and that creates the mold strong enough to hold down the molten bronze at a 200 Fahrenheit temperature.
And you can actually see in the background, like right beneath the clock up there, when he talks about the buildup of the material, ultimately it ends up looking something like that. So they start with like it's a really fine sand in the beginning.
Very fine silica that is going to start capturing and reproducing the detail that you see in the wax. So we go from the finest all the way to the coarse that we'll use at the final stage of the process just to give it the strength and the thickness necessary for the shell to be strong enough to hold the molten bronze.
Right. Okay. And then there's the metal pour.
There you go. So once the shells are finished in our shell department, then we take those out, and we have a kiln in the back. You can almost see it back there. So we bring those shells, and we cook those shells for about 3 hours to get them vitralized. The excess heat that they go is probably about 900 to 1,000 degrees. And in the process of doing that, we are crystallizing, we're fusing. Technically, they're turning into glass in the inside. The wax melts out, and it's just leave the empty mold for the bronze to be poured. So separately, we melt, we have our crucible, and we melt about 450 pounds 3 times a week. And we bring the temperature of that bronze to about 2,100 degrees. And we, at the same time, bring the molds to about 1,000 degrees temperature. So when you pour the molten bronze inside, it doesn't crack and it doesn't break. So you almost need to bring the temperature above about the same. So when you have the molten bronze going into the mold, it will reproduce also. It's going to feel completely all of the artwork that needed it to be reproduced.
So for you, though, you got a wonderful thing, temperature, right? Outdoors.
Right.
So you guys pour at a certain time of day.
Mm-hmm.
And then what do you do with when the weather is, like, say today, it's different.
Yeah. Well,
than
basically,
normal.
we need to adapt based on the conditions. For instance, during summertime, we had to lower our temperatures because the room temperatures will be different. You have to almost treat all the molds a little bit differently during summertime because of the ambient temperature is totally different. When the weather is cold, obviously everything's colder, and the temperature of the shells will drop faster than on a regular summer day. So we need to prepare and adjust our temperatures based on the season that we're going to be working.
So you guys can kind of see this is an art in and of itself. And so the next portion of the process would be sandblast. So what I don't think we did a good job of kind of explaining that previous step, in the sense that a lot of those pieces that you saw in there would have been assembled into larger pieces later, right? Like, you can see Batman would ultimately have been, and you'll see later in the presentation, something like 22, 23 pieces.
Like 28 parts that we had to cast separately.
Right.
And basically, once all of these parts get poured and they get ready to be assembled, there are going to be a whole bunch of parts that we need to go back and remove all the gates that I was explaining you that we add for the bronze to be injected into the molds. So we had to cut and prepare all of those parts, and they go through the process. I think our next slide is going to be metal chasing. So we'll explain a little bit about the metal chasings. But basically what we're going to be doing will be like, we get all of those parts, and then we get an artist, metal chaser, that is going to start to assemble the piece by welding and putting all the pieces together. Put a structural armature if it is required, like in all monuments. We have to work with engineers that will sign off and give us the details of what the internal armature needs to be. These artisans and artists that do the metal chasing, they have to come back and do the welding and come back and recreate the texture that get lost in the process of doing the welding. Once you get all the pieces assembled and ready to be approved by the artist, then it's going to look like the Batman you're seeing right now on the screen. And the sandblast of all of that will kind of blend all the texture and remove all the different colors from the welding. The heat on the welding is going to create different coloration, and also the texture is going to look a little bit different because of the tool marks and all of that. So that's why we need to sandblast the part so that we can go back and look at it and see what else it's going to need, because remember, it's going through the hands of a human, so it's going to have tool marks, it's going to have details that get lost in the process. And it is our job to make sure that those details and those imperfections, if we can call them imperfection, get removed and not being able to be visualized on the final product.
So a question came through is, where did you learn all of this?
I have a friend that actually makes the joke, and he said, the little kid asked an old man and say, "How do you become cowboy?" And the cowboy back says, well, kid, you don't go to school to become a cowboy. You become a cowboy when there's nothing else you can do. So basically, we had to learn all of this trick and all of these techniques by experience. There's nothing that school is going to teach you when it comes to do the final metal chasing. You almost need to apply your talent. Most of the time, you have to create your own tools to come back and reproduce specific textures that are on different sculptures. Not everybody sculpts with the same kind of tools, so sometimes you're going to have scratches that are intentional on the pieces. Sometimes you have smooth surfaces. Other times you're going to have like fabric material type of texture that you need to reproduce, and most of the times you don't find those tools like on the open market. So you almost have to think in reverse and create your own tools to come back and reproduce the textures that are on each individual piece.
Yeah, it would be easy to equate this to a trade, right? Like you would think that you could just learn from someone else and they would teach you kind of the tools of the trade, like a plumber or electrician. But realistically, it's more akin to being an artist yourself, right? Because like Angel said, they are kind of inventing their tools, they're inventing their own methodologies. All of the art that comes through the foundry is different. And so, you could be doing this for 20 years and then you get a piece in there and you're like, okay, how are we going to reproduce that? And you kind of just figure it out as you go. Which is why I have such immense respect, specifically for those two departments, the wax department and the metal chasing department, because they really are artists in their own right. To be able to reproduce some of those fine details and textures, it takes an artist's eye and an artist's hand. And we do have an incredible team at AFA, which is, why we get to do projects like this. People trust our expertise.
This is the, something that you never stop learning. Like we have people over there that have been doing this for 35, 40 years. And we get a new hire. Somebody comes into the company, and they come back from a different foundry or a different business, and then they say, well, I think I have an idea on how to make this a little more efficient. And they come back with a different idea, and even though our existing employees been doing this for 35 or 40 years, they learn something from someone that was doing the same kind of work, but using a different tool, a different method of welding, or a different material. So it's something that you never start learning.
All right, so just to move forward here, so that was sandblast. We did talk a bit about metal chasing. We didn't have a slide for it anyway, so that's fine. Let's kind of talk about patina, because what you see here is the finished work before installation, and obviously it looks a little bit different than the raw bronze. So can we talk about, one, why we do a patina, and two, why did we choose this particular patina? Because we have the ability to reproduce virtually any color you can think of, right? So you would think, oh, we're going to do Batman, maybe we'll put him in a gray suit, black suit, that'll look great. There's a reason that we choose these types of patinas for public sculptures, specifically those that are going to be outdoors. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, when you're dealing with public art, you have to almost think futuristically what is that is going to happen. You put it on a public place, you have people that is going to constantly come by and wants to take their selfie, get close to it. You get vandals that are going to throw a can of soda, or, you get the wild child that's going to get a crayon, is going to kind of draw on it. So you almost need to think in advance and choose the proper patina for the pieces that are going to be in public. And just to give you like a quick explanation of what patina is a kind of chemical oxidation that we make artificially on bronze. So depending on the color that you want to use, that you want to recreate, then you choose the right chemical. And that chemical, it gets applied by using heat. Then you lay the chemical either using a brush or a spray gun, or anything that you can just use to throw the chemical into the figure. Then you can use something like that. And with the with the torch, you are like expediting whatever Mother Nature is going to be doing to the bronze. Those cold nights and the hot days, those changes in temperature are going to affect the finish on the pieces. So when you do it in a more controlled way by using the heat and the specific chemicals they're going to be using, like you can see on Batman, the logos, the belt, they have a little bit of a different coloration. That's because we use different chemicals to create those sudden changes. But when the pieces are in public, they get treated by Mother Nature. You get rain, and you almost need to predict what the ambient where the piece is going to be displayed going to do to the bronze. So you almost need to kind of guide it in that direction in a more controlled way. So when the pieces are like 20 years already installed, they still are looking in a way that still is attractive to the public.
That's why, we alluded to this earlier, but that's why we didn't do it in black or gray or some other color. They won't hold up, right? The UV from the sun, rain, all that stuff. It all affects how these chemicals change over time. This particular patina, which is why you see it so often on public works of art. I mean, whenever you see a bronze, more often than not, it looks like this, right, when it's outside. And there's a reason for that. It's not because we don't want to be, colorful and inventive. It's that it will continue to look like this, more or less, for the next 10 or 20 years, whereas if we did it in black or gray, it would look black or gray for about 3 months, and then it would start to change pretty substantially.
Start to change, yeah.
So that is the foundry process. So the third portion of this is, okay, we talked about the ZBrush workflow. We've talked about the lost wax casting or the bronze casting workflow. Now, what are some of the considerations you need to make before you attempt to blend those two workflows together? And so we're going to go back to Alejandro's work. This is the original sculpt that he did for DC Direct. And you'll notice it's been cut and keyed as if it's going to be a collectible, because like I said, it was. Unfortunately, for the bronze casting process, we need one contiguous surface to work with, right? And the reason we need one contiguous surface is that the cuts that you guys make that are appropriate for casting a collectible or an action figure are not necessarily the same cuts that we would make that would be appropriate for welding. So a perfect example of this is you can see that key right under Batman's cowl and cape, right? And it's been made to just pop right on top of the torso. And for an action figure, that's great. For us, it would be nearly impossible for us to weld those pieces together. And so we need a little bit more agency, a little bit more control, a little bit more flexibility over where those cuts are made, which is why we would prefer something like this. So I would imagine that probably makes your lives a little bit easier because you can just sculpt a complete sculpt. You don't have to worry about cutting and keying and all the things that we talked about earlier. You can just sculpt a complete piece like this. So with Batman in mind, again, we're going to go back to the finished piece. These are some specific considerations that needed to be made to make this sculpt appropriate for public consumption. So one of the things that we did is we had Alejandro bring the cape in closer to the leg. And the reason we did that is we had to close off what's called a pinch point. So Angel talked about this earlier. When you've got sculptures out there, people do weird things, right? And so sometimes you get children that will try to stick their head in something. We don't want that. Or just an adult with poor judgment. We don't want that either. So we had to bring that a little bit closer to close off that pinch point. We also removed the utility belt in the back detail. So let me go back to this slide right here. You can see on the very far right, Alejandro originally sculpted all of this fantastic detail in the back of Batman's back, right? And he fully sculpted the back of the utility belt, and it was great. For an action figure or a collectible, where maybe the cape has a little bit of flexibility and you can see underneath, great. But you're not going to see that with a bronze sculpture, right? That cape's not going anywhere. So there's no sense in having the detail back there because you're just adding complexity and expense to a project that's already pretty expensive, right? Bronze is not cheap. And so that's one of the reasons that when Alejandro went back in, he left that detail out. So basically, Batman's cape functions as his back. We also made the cape a single wall versus a double wall. And the reason we did that is if we were to scale up that original sculpt from 7 inches all the way to 7.5 feet, the bottom of the cape would have been like this thick, right? And it would have weighed 600 pounds. So we haven't gotten into Wonder Woman yet, but that whole sculpture weighs 600 pounds. Batman's cape alone would have been 600 pounds. So Alejandro did, not we. Alejandro went back in, and he sculpted this as a single wall. And I'm telling you, when you see it in person, he did such a fantastic job because you wouldn't really notice the difference. Aesthetically, it still looks like Batman's cape. So it should also be noted that when he went back in and did the second sculpt, he got notes from Jim Lee again, right, to make sure that he was maintaining the artistic integrity of the piece. So this was a very collaborative project. DC was involved, Warner Brothers was involved. Everybody had to kind of check off to be like, okay, we'll make these changes, but we want to make sure it still looks like Batman. And then the last thing we did is we rounded off and we added thickness to the blades on the gauntlet for obvious reasons, right? You don't want children running into, literal blades on Batman's gauntlet. And so we had to thicken those up a bit.
And just so you guys know, we also check in with engineers and building and safety. It's not the same kind of design or the same kind of rules that we need to play if the sculpture is going to be installed in California versus if it's going to be installed in Florida. They deal with hurricanes, we deal with earthquakes. So all of this is a collaborative effort between the artists, the foundry, the final location where it's going to be installed. There are inspectors that come by and verify that everything is approved and done based on the engineer's point of view about the project. So all of that needs to be a collaboration between all of those entities.
Yep. So now to Wonder Woman. Considerations, or some considerations that needed to be made about her composition. You can notice, like we talked about earlier, there were some considerable changes made to the composition. The spear, again, for obvious reasons, you cannot have people climbing up and impaling themselves on the spear. So you had to remove the spear, which is unfortunate. What doesn't seem as obvious is it's obvious to the eye, but why we did it. It's not obvious why we removed the cape. But it turned out that it was a pedestrian hazard. And so imagine you're in Warner Brothers Visitor Center, and somebody's, walking around on their phone, and they see Wonder Woman's head up here, but they don't see the cape, and then, there's a lawsuit right there. So unfortunately, because that's one of the cooler features of that original sculpt, they had to remove the cape. So Jack went back in, and he did that. We also modified the shield so that it was a single wall versus a double wall for the same reason that we did it with Batman's cape. And then one of the biggest changes was actually to her hair. So I know a lot of time and energy, and there was a lot of collaboration again with DC and Warner Brothers. They were like, okay, well, we got to change the hair. We want it to still look like Wonder Woman, and so there was a lot of time spent to make that hair look the way it was, or the way it does. But again, the reason that was changed is that you couldn't have those little wisps of hair that look like they're kind of flying in the wind, because they could potentially be bent if somebody climbed the statue, and they kind of came to a point. So it was the same issue with the gauntlets, and so those changes needed to be made too. So these are some of the things that you kind of have to think about when you're creating something for public consumption at scale, as opposed to like a smaller collectible that sits on a shelf. The second thing you want to look for, which is pretty obvious, is just going to be resolution. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but it's obvious that if you're going to be doing something at 1/8 scale, you can probably get away with fudging it a little bit, right? Like, you don't have to put as much detail in the utility belt. You don't have to put as much detail in anything, really. And that's not to say that he didn't, but there's only so much you're going to see. When you scale it up to 7.5 feet, it's a different story. So when Alejandro went back in, he put a ton of new detail in the utility belt, a ton of new detail in the cape, really just a ton of new detail across the board. Because again, it was a completely new sculpt from the ground up. Wonder Woman, similar story, right? So Jack went back in and added a bunch of details specifically into her armor. And then, we talked a lot about the hair. There was a lot of time spent on the hair, too. And then the last...
Did he did the updating of the hair as well? Then?
Yes.
Yes, so everything went back to him. He had to do all those updates as well.
Yes. Yep.
Safety first. What did we learn today?
Yeah.
If you take anything away from bronzing, safety first.
Yep.
Safety first, yep.
Also, don't stick your head where it doesn't belong. It's just not, it's not a good idea.
And another one.
Yeah. I hope you guys know that already, but, So, yeah, we alluded to this earlier. I won't spend a bunch of time here. But I just wanted to revisit the safety points because these are big considerations. And again, they're different with every project, but I would say pinch points and sharp edges are probably two of the biggest things that we look for. So, right, Batman's gauntlet, sharp edges, and then his cape being brought closer to the back leg That was to close off those pinch points. And then for Wonder Woman, removal of the spear and removal of the cape.
So those were the final pieces on the hand for the blades on him? That was the final one? Or was
Which one are we looking
Can
at?
we go back one more?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that
and
that is what ended up being put on him.
Right. And it's difficult to tell from, really, I wish we had like a different angle so you could see how they were thickened. But when you see it from the backside, and I encourage, if you guys are local, great, you've got time to go see these sculpts, or these statues rather.
Easy access to them.
They're 10 minutes away, right? For those of you who are maybe like here from out of town and maybe you're flying out the next day or Monday or whatever, go check these things out because we can talk about these until we're blue in the face and you're going to see some imagery of the finished sculpts. But seeing them in person is just a whole different ballgame. It really is. I haven't seen Wonder Woman in person yet, but I have seen Batman. And man, just standing in front of that sculpture, like he really does feel like the Dark Knight. I know he's not canonically 7.5 feet tall, but you get I wouldn't want to see that dude in a dark alley. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so for those that are local, the Batman's in front of the AMC Theater in Burbank, down there, if you were there. And then the Wonder Woman's in the entrance to the visiting center of Warner
Brothers Visitor Center. Yep.
They're like 10 minutes from each other.
Exactly.
Both.
It would
They're
be
real
totally easy to do within a day.
Yeah, but you're not allowed to go until after the ZBrush Summit. It's just
right. You got
okay. You're all
wait another day or two
here.
Okay, so we went through the ZBrush workflow, kind of. We went through the bronze casting workflow, and then we talked about some of the considerations that needed to be made. Now we can blend the two processes together. So this is kind of what I guess the view that we have, right? So we will get a file from, say, somebody like Alejandro, and then we will send it off to our printing partner, Form 3D. And our contact over there, Troy, understands the casting process, and so we can go back and forth and say, okay, this is where we think we need to make the cuts that will make it easier for us to ultimately weld together. And so what you're looking at here is a diagram that he would send back and say, okay, these are where the cuts will be made, these are the panels that I'll print, and I'll send these to you. Now, it's difficult to see, but within these panels are smaller panels. And so these are the cuts that make sense for us, but there's only so much space in the printer, and so oftentimes, even though, and we're going to get to the printer we use, it's pretty large, there's only so much space to nest the panels, and so sometimes what he'll do is he'll take, say, section 16 that may have been 4 panels, and he'll piece those back together for us before he sends them out. So what you're looking at are the pieces that we get, the pieces that we receive, and then ultimately we go through the whole process of recreating them in bronze. But that's not necessarily what's printed out. Is there anything you wanted to add to that? Or is
No,
okay.
You're good.
You did good, Chris.
I'm trying here. I'm trying. Yeah. Okay, so Wonder Woman, similar story, far less complex. You can see there's fewer parts. I want to say there's 10 or 11 there versus Batman that had how many?
Like 28 parts.
20 yeah. So not much to add for that slide. Okay, so when it comes to the printing, I would imagine most of you that are, if you're printing at a consumer level, you're probably using something like the printer on the left, right? One of myriad different resin printers. This is a Form 3. We use an industrial-grade printer by VoxelJet, and so it's difficult to get a sense of scale with the two next to each other, but a full-size human being could stand next to the VoxelJet, and their head would probably come to about the top. So it's a pretty big machine. So that's the VX1000. The one pictured, because for whatever reason I couldn't find a good picture of the VX1000, that's the high-speed version. We use the standard version because it has a higher resolution. The only difference is the screen is on the right instead of the left. I don't know. But that's essentially what it looks like. So why do we use the VX1000? Well, for one, it's got a larger build platform, so it allows us to print out larger panels, right? Which is really important when you're doing something that's 7.5 feet tall. And then as far as the process goes, it's a little bit different than a lot of the other printers that I would imagine you guys have some experience with. So it actually prints in a substance called PMMA, just like a powdered acrylic. And so what happens is that bar you see in the middle there, that's called the recoder. And that applies this uniform layer of PMMA at about 100 to 150 micrometers, or micrometers, depending on how you pronounce it. And then another print head will come over, and it doses the binder. So we use something called cyanacrylate. It's basically a glue, right? It's a glorified glue. But they'll do this in concert. So you get a whole layer of PMMA, and then the print head comes over and doses the binder within the print area, and then a whole layer of PMMA back and forth. And so it does this over the course of many hours as roughly a vertical build speed of about 18 millimeters per hour.
That's if you're using the whole build plate?
Yes. Yeah. So these are what the panels look like when we get them. And there's a process called wax infiltration, and this is why we use this method as opposed to one of the various other methods, is because remember, in the traditional lost wax casting process, our artisans are accustomed to using wax, right, to chasing and cleaning up wax. The beauty of printing on these printers is that, honestly, they come out really clean, so it doesn't require a lot of additional work. But even still, by infusing that PMMA panel with wax, we make it combustible, which is super important for the lost wax casting process because, again, we need to melt that wax out. Well, the PMMA is not going to melt out by itself. You need to infuse it, or they call it infiltrating, with wax. So that's the first reason. The second reason is it stiffens the material so it doesn't collapse during shelling. The PMMA, when it's printed out, those panels are not as strong as like traditional wax, so they need to be reinforced. And then finally, like I talked about, it gives us a surface that's easier to clean up. Although, credit to VoxelJet and the VX1000 in particular, there's some really clean prints, so it doesn't really require a lot of cleanup. If you see that image on the right, so that's one of the images that we looked at earlier, remember? Now you can see what some of those panels would have looked like when we printed them out. So Batman's cowl there, his face, and a bit of his shoulder would have been, it looks like part one. And then the second image, the one in the middle, would have been, it looks like part two.
Yeah, the cape.
Yeah, so you can kind of get a sense for what these things would look like once they've been printed out and sent to us. So now we are essentially back to kind of where we started for the lost wax casting process, except now we get to eliminate the mold because nobody brought anything to us in clay. We get to eliminate the wax pull because we had these pieces sent to us, like they didn't need to be pulled out of the mother mold. And essentially the rest of the process is the same, right? So now that PMMA panel that's been infiltrated with wax functions as the wax portion of the process, and so we chase it and gate it and shell it and burn it out until ultimately.
Just so you guys know, the wax chasing is also minimum because technically the 3D print will come out a lot more cleaner. So it's minimal chasing what is required when it comes from the 3D print.
Right. Yep. And then this is the finished work. So this is Batman that was installed outside of the AMC, like we've mentioned a few times. Some of these shots I got from Alejandro. Again, he was great about sending some of this stuff over. So that is what Batman looks like, fully installed on the plinth and everything. And then here's some additional detail shots that I got from Alejandro, which I thought were great. I wanted to include those too. And then we have Wonder Woman, who's been installed outside of the Warner Brothers Visitor Center. Just a fun little anecdote. I learned after the fact that I guess, leadership at Warner Brothers, they're like, oh, it'd be really great to have Wonder Woman facing the Warner Brothers studio tour. Like, that would look really cool. That's a great photo op. And then they found that when people wanted to take pictures of Wonder Woman, they would be taking them the other direction because they want Wonder Woman behind them. So I think ultimately they're like, maybe we should have turned her the other way. But for right now, that is the direction that she has been installed.
Looks like I go back out there and move it, huh?
Yeah, hey, I mean, if they want us to do it, we'll do it. So you just give us a call, Warner Brothers. And so that's it. That is the process of taking a Sculpt in ZBrush all the way to Monumental bronze.
Okay, we got time still for some questions here. One came through online. I'm going to go do online, and I'm going to come to you next. So what about, you mentioned 10 years, like the Patina last 10 years or 15 years or whatever it was. What do you do after the 10 years? You guys are being called out. I know you went back out for the Batman recently.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Well, we haven't done it yet, but
that was for vandalism.
Yeah,
so that was a little different.
Yeah.
Well, patinas are something that they just keep evolving. What we normally say in foundry terms is bronze is alive and just keeps going. Sometimes what Mother Nature does to the pieces that are out in public, they just make more beautiful. Mother Nature puts some green touches to it, some highlights, and they just keep going. They just make it really beautiful. But most of the cases when vandals come by and vandalize the pieces, scratches, break parts, they need to be removed and brought back to the foundry so they can be properly treated. Sometimes we have to sandblast the entire figure, do all of the repairs that are required, and a new patina gets to get applied. We also recommend on most of the projects that are outdoors that there's a maintenance program that needs to be done. Yeah. Technically, someone needs to physically go on site and remove all the buildup that is going to be on top of the bronzes, put a coat of wax on it, buff it, kind of like whatever you can do to your car, basically the same thing.
So that, just to answer that question really briefly, that's essentially what you would do after the 10 years.
After the 10 years.
It's more maintenance than
Maintenance,
any.
correct.
Yeah.
Okay, question right here on the floor.
Thank you, guys. I'm so happy to have had a chance to ask this question. It might be a little indelicate, but when you are an artist and you are conceiving a piece, what are the elements that come into play that affect your pricing ultimately when you are creating a piece? So a 15-inch sculpture.
Yeah.
Let's talk. What would make that more? What would be one element that would make it more price affordable? What would complicate and make things more expensive?
Sure, that's not indelicate at all. That's probably one of the most common questions we get, right? So, Angel, what are some of the determining factors for price?
We have a term that we say, you have to make it foundry friendly. And by saying that, technically what we're saying is minimize the undercuts, minimize, obviously you want to end up with a product that you sculpt that is your creation, but fragile, like little pieces of hair sticking out, all of that means most of the time that it's going to have to be like jewelry cast. All jewelry cast is a lot more expensive. You have mentioned something about 10 inches. 10 inches is kind of like borderline to be cast. I will encourage you, if you want to create something, to stay within, I want to say probably 16 inches to 20
yeah, 15.
or 15.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. Size-wise, probably between 16 and 24 inches are probably the more common tabletop type of sculptures that you're going to see in the galleries, and those are more like foundry-friendly because of the size. When you get too small, you enter the field of jewelry casting, and when you go above half life size, then you're almost, at a different scale, different level.
And it, just very briefly, because I know we're running out of time here, but it also depends on the complexity of the piece, like how textured it is, how many little small kind of nuances. And, like if our artisans in wax have to spend 3 times the amount, right, like cleaning that up, and same thing in metal, obviously there's an expense associated with that. And so that would make the overall price a little bit more expensive. So it's difficult to say like, oh, you would think every 15-inch sculpture would be priced kind of similarly, and they are to an extent, but ones that are more complicated to deal with are obviously going to take more time, and there's more expense associated with that.
The other thing that we normally do with artists is, if they have like a tight budget, we allow them to come by to the foundry and do some of the work themselves, because labor is expensive, and if you can minimize the labor of the wax cleaner and the metal tooler, then you are going to be saving some money. I think we're running out of time.
No, we got time. We got 6
time?
minutes.
Okay.
And then obviously it's going to come down to the price of bronze.
That is correct.
Time,
yeah,
right?
Bronze fluctuates on the market. Sometimes it's very very similar to what the oil does. So if the price of gasoline is high, the price of bronze is high.
I think that's just a rule. Gas high, everything high.
Yeah, pretty
I
much.
think that's the rules is. All right, got a question over here. Then I'm going to come in the back here, on my way. Here you go.
So I kind of have a two-part question. So the first question is like, how do you decide how to cut up the piece, like before you're getting ready to like do the casting pieces?
Yep.
And then once you cast them, you did mention like when you do the other process of the wax mold or if it's a clay mold in the seams, if you cast it and then weld it, how do you get the detail back in those seam areas?
Yeah. That's where the experience come by, right? So, first of all, we encourage all of the artists to bring us the sculpture the way they have it. You know, you sculpt the entire figure. Sometimes you get the client that say, well, I can cut it for you. And we always say, let's just bring it by. We'll make those decisions because, you know, we have the client that said, well, I don't want the cut to be obvious right here on the arm, so I want to cut it really close to the shoulder. But then we say, well, it's going to be very difficult for us to do the welding. It's like a point where it's no reach for the welding torch to be used. So we kind of decide where the cuts are going to be so that we can come back and do the assembly in a way that doesn't compromise the integrity of the final artwork. Coming back and doing the welding, that's where the experience come by, and the tools that I was describing to you. Sometimes you have to create your own tools to come back and reproduce the texture that is done originally by the artist.
Just very quickly, the oversimplified version of that answer is we make the cuts where we think we can hide the welds the best, right?
Correct.
So sometimes that's going to be in a folded fabric. Sometimes that's going to be in some texture that we think we can more easily reproduce. It depends. It's very like project specific, but that's why like we want to bring our interest or rather our experience to bear on that because you know, we've been doing this in Angel's case for 33 years, right? He's got a really good idea of where he can hide those welds the best. And so that's why we want that flexibility. We want that agency to be able to make those determinations ourselves.
Correct.
Is there a question on the floor? No? No? Oh, there's another one. There's another one. Let me go here first, and then I'll come to you. Here you go.
Hello. I'm assuming Batman is hollow. How thick is the bronze wall, and then how much does Batman weigh?
Oh, very important question. About when it comes to the casting world, we try to stick with a minimum thickness of about 3/16 of an inch. Between 3/16 and 1/4 of an inch is ideal. So you guessed it right, Batman and most of the castings that you're going to see are hollow, and we always try to stick with those perimeters between 3/16 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. There's going to be some areas where it's difficult to maintain, you know, that specific thickness, and then we cast it solid, like in smaller figures. Most of the time, the arms are going to be solid because it will be difficult to make it hollow.
All right, we got another question right here.
Hi. So obviously, the examples you showed us there with Batman and Wonder Woman are sculptures done for a very large company and organization. How accessible is the bronze casting process to, say, you know, a small independent artist?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we can both answer. You'd be surprised, right? So we do have a bit of a reputation for doing larger work. In fact, it's funny, you know, the artist before us spoke about all that work that he had done with us. We've done work for Steve Wang. We did this huge monumental scale version at Kerrigan that's out in front of Blizzard headquarters. We've done stuff for Disney. So we do all that, but we do work with a lot of individual artists who will do, you know, smaller edition runs. I think that's probably the distinction, though, is that, you know, a lot of the artists that we work with, and Angel, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're doing editions. They're not just necessarily doing one-offs, but we have a lot of people doing one-offs too. So I guess it just kind of depends on where you're at. It's obviously easier to afford something like this, because I won't lie to you, it's obviously considerably more expensive than casting in resin. It's easier to afford something like this if you're an established artist who has a name, who's creating editions. But it's not so expensive that it's inaccessible to someone who's really passionate about this, for instance. And does want to cast something, specifically at that size we talked about earlier, 16 to 24 inches, I think you would be surprised at how accessible that is to normal, everyday artists.
You still get the moms and pops that, you know, want to create like the head or the bust of a grandchild. They come to the foundry, we give them a prize based on their creation. It's pretty accessible. Most of the times we deal with galleries and local artists as well. So basically what they do is they make their creation and they have already someone that's interested on it. They say, you know, I can cast it in bronze for you. It's going to cost you so much. And then they sell it to the first person that's interested on it, and by the time they pay for it, they have already covered the cost of the mold and the casting, or the 3D print and the casting, and they can continue as they go. If they sell another one, they can easily just call us up and say, oh, I sold the one, I need another one. We pull the wax, and they pay the deposit, we cast the second one. So it's kind of like an edition type of things.
Okay. Well, last question from online. I'm going to give them to me online, and then we'll let you get off the stage here. What's the biggest sculpture that you've had to cast in bronze?
That's a good question.
Good question. For you guys that are familiar with the area in Beverly Hills, there is a Torah that is hanging off a Jewish temple that is called Sinai Temple, I think, on Beverly Glen, and I think it's Wilshire Boulevard and Beverly Glen. There is a Torah, a Jewish scroll of God hanging or passing the Torah to the Jewish community. It's hanging from the building. It's about 30, I think it's about 30 feet tall. So we did that back in 2001.
Yeah.
It's just a small project.
Yeah, a small project.
And hanging, too.
Yeah, that was a big challenge. We had to close the street. We had to rent a crane to lift it up. There were engineers kind of designing how it's going to hang from that side of the building. We had to drill some holes into the concrete to brace it with some steel cables. It was a major thing.
So actually, if I can leave you guys with something, the one thing that I would want to kind of impart about AFA, and specifically our CEO who couldn't be here today, Brett Barney, he loves those types of things. Like, he loves kind of pushing the envelope, figuring out how to complete projects that maybe other foundries like couldn't do or refused to do because it was just, you know, too complex or take too much time. We encourage you guys, that's why we have the contact information up here. If you guys have any questions about projects that you want to pursue, big or small, reach out. We love having conversations about that kind of stuff. And even if ultimately you guys end up not going that route, we'd love to have those conversations with you so you have a better understanding of if this is really accessible for you. Like, if you do want to, you know, create something 16 to 24 inches tall, like, let's talk about it. Send over your sculpts, and let's have a conversation. Because, like I said, Brett, he's kind of garnered a reputation, especially in the past few years, for kind of pushing the envelope and, you know, moving into areas where traditional foundries typically are not. So we do like a lot of architectural elements, a lot of high-end furniture. What we showed today was the more figurative side of the business, but we do, I mean, if it can be cast, we've probably done it. Yeah. And so if you guys have this wild, crazy project that you guys are considering, you know, trying to partner with a foundry for, reach out. We'd love to have that conversation.
We are always pushing the envelope. We are combining, you know, the ancient technology of lost wax casting process with the state-of-the-art ZBrush type of creation. So we are always combining and looking for good ideas to make the process accessible to the public and cost-effective for everybody.
Yep. That's it.
Oh, that's a long. You got a long clap. You guys know you're going to have to do this again, right? Because now I got to officially tell them they have to leave and get off the stage. Okay,
Well,
so
we'll
get your
go.
hands
It's fine.
ready.
It's fine.
All right, it's ready.
Thank you,
Ladies
guys.
and gentlemen, AFA.
Thank you,
Chris and
everyone.
Angel.
Thank you.